When an avoidant mistreats you, the story they tell themselves is simple. I needed space. I chose myself. I regained my freedom. That narrative feels empowering on the surface, but psychologically, something very different is happening underneath. They didn't lose you because you were weak, demanding, or replaceable. They lost you because you were doing something their nervous system desperately needed, regulating chaos they never learned how to manage on their own. Avoidants are not emotionally cold by nature. They are emotionally overloaded. Their early experiences taught them that closeness equals pressure, expectation, or loss of control. So they learned to survive by staying self-contained, independent, unreachable. But here's the paradox. Even the most avoidant individuals still crave safety. Not excitement, not intensity, safety. And when you came into their life, you provided it without forcing it. You didn't calm them by fixing them. You calmed them by being consistent. Your presence lowered their internal alarm system. Conversations felt easier. Silence felt less threatening. They could breathe around you. And that's the part they never consciously register. They don't say, this person stabilizes my nervous system. They say, this is getting too close, because calm feels unfamiliar when chaos is what you grew up with. So when they mistreat you, pull away, devalue, disappear, withhold, they believe they are protecting themselves. They believe distance equals safety. But what they are actually doing is removing the very thing that was keeping them regulated. That's why avoidants often feel fine at first after a breakup. Relief, lightness, a sense of control. Their system interprets distance as a win. Then the delayed effect hits. Without you, there is no emotional buffer, no grounding presence, no one absorbing the overflow of stress they don't know how to process internally. The nights get louder, the mind becomes restless, irritation increases, sleep becomes shallow. They jump from distraction to distraction, not because they miss you romantically, but because their system is searching for the stability it lost. This is why replacements never work the way they expect. New people can provide novelty, validation, even sex. But they cannot recreate emotional safety without time, vulnerability, and trust, the very things avoidants resist. So every new connection feels stimulating but unstable, exciting but hollow, and slowly a realization begins to form, even if they never articulate it. I felt calmer before. Here's the part most people misunderstand. Avoidants don't miss you the way anxious partners miss. They don't ache openly. They don't reminisce emotionally. They feel the loss somatically in their body, in their stress levels, in their irritability, in their inability to settle. Your absence shows up as dysregulation, not longing. And that's why mistreating you becomes the quiet turning point. Because once you're gone, the illusion collapses. The freedom they chase doesn't feel expansive. It feels unanchored. What they called independence starts to feel like isolation. What they framed as strength starts to feel like emotional exhaustion. They didn't just lose a relationship, they lost access to a version of themselves that functioned better, a calmer version, a more present version, a version that didn't have to work so hard to stay in control. And the most destabilizing part, they can't fully explain why everything feels harder now. You see, emotional safety is invisible while you have it. It's only when it disappears that the cost becomes clear. And by then the damage is done. Because someone who provides safety and is then mistreated doesn't usually return. Not in the same way. Not without losing themselves. So when an avoidance life begins to unravel after mistreating you, it isn't karma, it isn't punishment, it's consequence. You were the regulation they never learned to build within themselves, and once they removed you, the system had to face itself alone. And that is the truth they can't run from. Losing you wasn't the loss of love. It was the loss of stability they never knew how to create on their... After the sense of relief fades, after the nervous system realizes that distance didn't bring peace, something else begins to surface. And this is where avoidant psychology becomes brutally honest. Guilt. Not the dramatic kind. Not the kind that leads to immediate apologies or emotional breakthroughs. This is a slow, corrosive guilt that lives beneath their daily functioning, quietly shaping their inner world. Avoidants are experts at emotional suppression. From an early age, they learned that feeling too much was dangerous. So instead of processing emotions, they learned to bury them, intellectualize them, rationalize them, push them so far down that they could function without being overwhelmed. And for a long time, this strategy works. Until it doesn't. When they mistreated you, they justified it. They told themselves you were too sensitive, too demanding, too emotional, too much. They reframed their withdrawal as logic, as maturity, as self-respect. But here's the psychological problem with that strategy. The mind can lie, but the nervous system keeps the receipts. Every human being has an internal moral compass, not a social one, not a cultural one, a biological one. We are wired to recognize when we harm someone who did not deserve it. Avoidance can override that signal temporarily, but they cannot erase it. It goes underground, and underground it grows louder. This guilt doesn't show up when they're busy. It shows up in stillness, late at night, in moments of failure. When something goes wrong at work, when another relationship collapses for reasons they can't explain, the memory of how they treated you resurfaces not as nostalgia, but as self-judgment. A quiet voice that says, I knew better, and I still did it. This is why avoidants often seem irritable, restless, or emotionally flat after the loss. They are expending enormous energy keeping that guilt suppressed. Emotional suppression isn't free. It requires constant effort. And the more guilt they bury, the more drained they become. They don't feel lighter, they feel heavier. What makes this guilt particularly destabilizing is that it attacks their self-concept. Avoidants don't see themselves as bad people. They see themselves as rational, controlled, self-sufficient. Mistreating someone who genuinely cared contradicts that identity. And when identity is threatened, the psyche reacts defensively. Denial, blame shifting, emotional shutdown. But denial has an expiration date. Eventually, the mind runs out of distractions. The ego gets tired of protecting the narrative. And what remains is the unfiltered truth. They were loved in a way they didn't know how to reciprocate. And instead of learning, they retreated. That realization doesn't come as a dramatic epiphany. It comes as discomfort, as shame, as a subtle but persistent sense of internal failure. This is why they rarely reach out to apologize. Not because they don't feel guilt, but because apologizing would fork them to fully face it. To admit not just that they hurt you, but that their avoidance has consequences. And that level of accountability threatens the very defenses that kept them emotionally functional for years. So instead, the guilt becomes an internal companion. It follows them into new relationships, into moments of connection, where vulnerability is required. It whispers, you will do this again. And that whisper becomes self-fulfilling. Because unresolved guilt doesn't lead to growth, it leads to repetition. And here's the most important part for you to understand. This guilt is not about losing you, it's about losing integrity, losing alignment with who they believe they were, losing the illusion that avoidance is harmless. They don't suffer because you walked away. They suffer because deep down they know why you had to. And that truth, unprocessed, unspoken, unresolved, becomes the voice they can't silence, no matter how far they run. Once guilt begins to hum beneath the surface, avoidants instinctively reach for the tools that have always protected them. Distraction, detachment, replacement. These strategies aren't random habits. They're survival mechanisms. For most of their lives, these coping methods worked well enough to keep emotional discomfort at bay. But after you, something changes. The strategies that once kept them functional begin to fail, and that failure is what truly destabilizes them. Avoidants rely heavily on external regulation. They keep their inner world manageable by controlling their environment. Staying busy, staying stimulated, staying emotionally non-committal. Work becomes an obsession. Social calendars fill up. New connections appear quickly. On the surface, it looks like resilience, productivity, moving on. But psychologically, this isn't healing. It's avoidance in motion. Before you, these tactics were sufficient because their relationships never reached the depth where real vulnerability was required. Emotional distance kept the system predictable, but with you, something deeper was activated. You didn't just engage their interest, you engaged their attachment system. And once that system has been activated, it doesn't simply shut off when the relationship ends. This is why the usual distractions start to feel ineffective. Work doesn't provide the same relief. Socializing feels draining instead of energizing. Even physical intimacy loses its grounding effect. The nervous system has tasted regulation through connection, and now stimulation without emotional safety feels empty. Avoidants often interpret this emptiness incorrectly. They assume they haven't found the right distraction yet, so they escalate, longer hours, more intensity, more novelty, new partners who are exciting but emotionally shallow. They chase the high thinking it will recreate the calm they lost. But calm and stimulation are not the same thing, and the body knows the difference. This is where frustration sets in. Begin to feel chronically unsatisfied without understanding why. Nothing holds their attention for long. They oscillate between restlessness and numbness. And because avoidants are uncomfortable with introspection, they externalize the discomfort. The world feels irritating. People feel demanding. Life feels heavier. What's really happening is simple, but deeply uncomfortable. Their coping mechanisms were never solutions. They were shields, and shields only work when nothing pierces them. You did, not by force, by consistency, by emotional availability, by being someone they didn't have to perform around. Once that experience exists, the psyche can't unlearn it. It becomes a reference point. And every future attempt at avoidance is measured against the memory of how regulated they once felt. That's why new connections fall flat. They don't fail because those people are inferior. They fail because the avoidant now knows what emotional grounding feels like and how rare it is. This realization is threatening. It suggests that their long-standing strategy for surviving relationships is flawed, that independence, as they defined it, came at a cost. And rather than confronting that truth, many avoidants double down on avoidance. They tell themselves they're not built for deep connection. They frame emptiness as freedom. They pathologize closeness instead of examining their fear of it. But the body doesn't buy the story. Over time, the mismatch between their narrative and their lived experience creates internal tension. Sleep becomes inconsistent. Anxiety rises without a clear cause. Motivation fluctuates. They begin to feel like they're always managing themselves rather than living. This isn't collapse, it's erosion. Slow, subtle, and exhausting. And here's the critical shift. Once coping mechanisms fail, avoidance is no longer comfortable. The strategies that once provided relief now amplify the discomfort they were meant to suppress. That's the moment the psychological cost of mistreating you becomes unavoidable. They didn't lose you and keep their emotional structure intact. They lost you and exposed the fragility of the structure itself. And when the systems you rely on to escape pain stop working, you're left with only two options: face what you've been running from, or live in a state of constant internal dissatisfaction that no distraction can fix. When coping mechanisms begin to fail, avoidants instinctively reach for the one thing that has always made them feel safe: control. Control over distance, control over timing, control over emotional access. For an avoidant, control feels like strength. It feels like certainty in a world that once felt unpredictable. And mistreating you, pulling away, withholding, staying emotionally superior, gave them a temporary sense of power they mistook for confidence. Avoidants often grow up in environments where control was the only way to stay regulated. Maybe emotions were chaotic. Maybe closeness came with obligation or criticism. So they learned early on that whoever needs less wins. Whoever feels less survives. Over time, emotional detachment became not just a defense, but an identity. I am the strong one. I am the one who doesn't need. When they sensed your emotional investment, that identity was triggered. Not because you were weak, but because your consistency challenged their hierarchy. You didn't try to dominate them. You didn't chase endlessly. You simply showed up. And presence without desperation destabilizes someone who equates power with emotional leverage. So they pulled back. They delayed responses. They created ambiguity, not as a conscious manipulation in most cases, but as an instinctive move to regain control. Distance restored their sense of dominance, and in the short term it worked. They felt grounded again, above the emotion, untouchable. But here's the critical psychological flaw. Control only works when someone is still participating. Control requires an audience. It requires reaction. It requires emotional investment on the other side. The moment you stop chasing, explaining, or proving, the power structure collapsed. Your withdrawal didn't feel like mutual distance to them. It felt like loss of leverage. The rules changed without warning. The dynamic they depended on, where they decided when closeness happened, no longer existed. And that is when control reveals itself for what it really is: a fragile substitute for emotional security. Avoidants confuse power with control because both create the illusion of safety. But real power is internal. It doesn't depend on someone else's reaction. Control does. And when control disappears, the avoidant is left exposed to the very feelings they were trying to avoid: helplessness, uncertainty, vulnerability. This is why avoidants often spiral after someone truly detaches. They may not immediately reach out. Pride holds them back. Ego steps in. But internally, something fractures. The sense of superiority they leaned on evaporates. They begin replaying interactions, not to reconnect emotionally, but to understand how they lost the upper hand. And the most destabilizing realization begins to form: I didn't leave them, they left me. That shift is profound because it removes the avoidant from the position of chooser and places them in the position of consequence. And for someone whose entire psychological structure is built on staying one step ahead emotionally, that is terrifying. Without control, they are forced to confront their limitations. They can't regulate closeness. They can't dictate distance. They can't reset the dynamic with silence. They are no longer managing the relationship. They are managing themselves. And many avoidants have never learned how to do that without external distance. This is where the identity crisis emerges. If I am not the one who leaves first, if I am not the one who needs less, then who am I? Some avoider. NTS respond by doubling down, becoming colder, more dismissive, more self-protective. Others begin to crack. Anxiety leaks through. Obsessive thinking increases. They feel compelled to regain control, even if they don't know how. But control can't be reclaimed once someone has emotionally detached. And that loss forces a reckoning. The power they believed they had was never real. It was borrowed from your willingness to stay. And when borrowed power disappears, only truth remains. Distance without connection isn't strength. It's isolation wearing confidence as a disguise. When control collapses, something far more uncomfortable takes its place: self-awareness. And for an avoidant, self-awareness is not neutral. It's threatening, because beneath the distance, beneath the independence, beneath the carefully constructed identity, there is a core fear they spend their entire lives trying not to touch. What if I'm not emotionally enough? Avoidants don't fear intimacy because they don't want it. They fear it because intimacy exposes limits. It asks questions they don't know how to answer. Can I stay present when things get heavy? Can I hold someone else's emotions without shutting down? Can I be seen without losing control? When you came into their life, those questions didn't need answers. Your steadiness carried the weight for both of you. But once you left, those questions became unavoidable. Your absence stripped away the comparison point that made them feel competent. When you were there, their emotional minimalism didn't stand out. In contrast to your depth, however, it eventually did. And when you walked away with dignity, not begging, not chasing, not collapsing, it confirmed something they had always suspected but never wanted to face: that emotional avoidance is not the same as emotional strength. This is where inadequacy enters the picture, not as self-pity, but as exposure. They begin to recognize that their limits weren't caused by the relationship, they were revealed by it. They didn't struggle because you asked for too much. They struggled because they didn't know how to meet what was being offered. That realization is brutal for someone whose identity is built on competence and self-reliance. Avoidants pride themselves on being capable, rational, unshakable. But emotional competence is different. It can't be faked. It can't be optimized through logic. It requires tolerance for disco, M-fort, presence in uncertainty, and the courage to stay engaged without escaping. And this is where shame quietly takes hold. Shame is not the belief that you did something wrong, it's the belief that something is wrong with you. Avoidants don't think, I handled that poorly. They think, I don't have what it takes. And because shame is intolerable, they don't sit with it. They hide from it. They intellectualize it. They tell themselves stories about incompatibility, timing, freedom, anything that prevents them from internalizing the truth. But shame doesn't disappear when it's ignored. It waits. It surfaces when they attempt closeness again, when someone else asks for presence, when a new partner expects emotional availability. Suddenly the old defenses activate faster, stronger. Not because they don't care, but because they now associate closeness with exposure, with being measured, with being found lacking. And here's the paradox: the more they avoid, the more inadequate they feel. Because avoidance reinforces the belief that they can't handle intimacy. Each withdrawal becomes evidence. Each missed opportunity becomes confirmation. Your role in this is crucial and often misunderstood. You are not the cause of their inadequacy. You are the contrast that revealed it. You showed them what emotional capacity looks like when it's embodied, not performed. And that mirror is impossible to forget. This is why avoidants often oscillate between idealizing and dev, eluding the person they lost. On one hand, you represent warmth, depth, and emotional intelligence. On the other, you represent a standard they don't feel able to meet. That tension creates internal conflict, longing mixed with resentment, admiration mixed with defensiveness. And unless they confront that fear directly, unless they build emotional capacity instead of running from it, the pattern continues. New relationships, same distance, different names, but the truth remains unchanged. Emotional inadequacy is not a permanent trait, it's a skill gap. And skill gaps can be closed, but only by those willing to feel what they've spent their lives avoiding. And that's the line that defines their future. Either they face the fear of being seen as not enough, or they continue proving it by never staying long enough to grow. At this point in the journey, everything converges on one unavoidable reality. Your absence is no longer just a loss, it's a reckoning. For an avoidant, nothing creates pressure to change like consequences they can't control. And your absence is the first consequence that doesn't respond to their usual defenses. Avoidants don't change because someone explains their pain better. They don't change because they are given more chances. They don't even change because they feel guilty. They change only when avoidance becomes more painful than growth. And losing someone who embodied safety, depth, and emotional steadiness creates exactly that kind of pain. What? And you are gone. There is no emotional shortcut, no regulation through proximity, no borrowed calm. Life becomes louder. Relationships feel thinner. Stress feels heavier. And for the first time, the avoidant has to sit with themselves without distraction, without a partner absorbing the emotional overflow they never learned to process. This is where the fork in the road appears. Some avoidants finally slow down. They begin to notice patterns, not just what went wrong with you, but what has gone wrong everywhere. Same ending, same distance, same emotional ceiling, and the realization hits them with uncomfortable clarity. I am the common denominator. That moment can be transformational. Pain becomes information. Shame becomes curiosity. Instead of running, they turn inward. They start asking different questions. Not why do relationships fail, but why do I shut down when things matter? That's where therapy works. That's where growth begins. That's where avoidance loosens its grip. But not everyone chooses that path. Others harden. They reinterpret the pain as proof that closeness is dangerous. They rewrite the story again, not to protect their ego, but to protect their fear. They become more distant, more self-reliant, more emotionally unreachable. On the surface, they look composed, functional, unbothered, but internally, something collapses quietly. Because the absence doesn't stop hurting, it just stops being conscious. And unresolved pain doesn't disappear. It calcifies. It shows up as cynicism, as emotional numbness, as chronic dissatisfaction they can't name. Life keeps moving, but it feels strangely muted. Success doesn't land, relationships don't satisfy, nothing ever quite reaches them. This is what people mean when they say their life was destroyed. Not in a dramatic sense, not in a visible crash, but in a slow erosion of emotional vitality. They survive, but they don't expand. They function, but they don't connect. Your absence becomes the dividing line between who they were and who they could have become. And here's the most important part for you to understand. This outcome is not your responsibility. You did not abandon them. You stopped abandoning yourself. You didn't punish them. You removed access to something they were mishandling. That boundary is not cruelty, it's clarity. Avoidants often believe they can return later when they feel safer, stronger, more prepared. But the truth is harsher and simpler. People who grow do so because the cost of staying the same becomes unbearable. And sometimes the pain of losing someone real is the only thing strong enough to break through decades of emotional avoidance. Whether that pain becomes a catalyst or a collapse is their choice. But one thing is certain, no avoidant walks away from the loss of someone who truly mattered unchanged. Your absence rewires them. It forces a confrontation with everything they've been running from. And in the end, that is the final truth. You were not the lesson. Losing you was. If there's one truth this entire conversation leads to, it's this. What happened between you and the avoidant was never just about love. It was about capacity, emotional capacity, psychological capacity, the ability to stay present when things become real. You didn't lose because you loved deeply. You didn't fail because you wanted connection. You became the turning point because you represented something the avoidant hadn't yet developed. Emotional stability without control, closeness without chaos, intimacy without self-erasure. The destruction we've talked about is not dramatic or theatrical, it's internal. It's the slow unraveling of illusions, the illusion that distance equals strength, the illusion that independence means not needing anyone, the illusion that avoiding pain protects you from it. In reality, avoidance only delays pain and compounds it. Your absence forced a confrontation they could no longer outrun, the loss of emotional safety, the weight of buried guilt, the failure of distraction, the collapse of control, the exposure of inadequacy, and finally, the consequence that demanded growth or guaranteed stagnation. And here's where the story becomes empowering, not for them, but for you. You were not meant to shrink yourself to make someone else feel safe. You were not meant to beg for presence, consistency, or emotional maturity. You were meant to be met, not mana. Jed, not avoided, not controlled. Walking away didn't make you cold, it made you aligned. It didn't mean you gave up. It meant you refused to participate in a dynamic that required you to disappear so someone else could stay comfortable. If the avoidant grows, it will be because losing you forced them to face themselves. If they don't, that too is information. Either way, your role is complete, because the final lesson of this entire journey is simple and unshakable. The right person doesn't fear your depth, they rise to it.